8 years ago, she loved a man with all her heart. 8 years ago, he disappeared. No goodbye, no message, no explanation. She told herself he was dead. That was the only way she could continue living. But tonight, in a crowded restaurant, under the cold yellow lights, she saw that face, those eyes. And the man standing surrounded by armed bodyguards, the most powerful mafia boss in America, looked back at her, then looked down at the child standing beside her, the child with his eyes. If you want to know what happens next, please like and comment the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has progressed. And don't go anywhere. The alarm went off at 4:13 in the morning, same as always, and Emery Holloway silenced it before the second buzz with the muscle memory of someone who had been doing this long enough that sleep had stopped feeling like rest and started feeling like a brief interruption in her actual life. She lay still for 3 seconds. That was her allowance. 3 seconds with her eyes open in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling above her bed that had been spreading slowly for 4 months. Because she hadn't called the landlord yet, because calling the landlord meant missing 20 minutes of sleep she didn't have, and she had run the math. And the math always came back the same way. There was no give anywhere in this life. No slack, no margin. She got up. The apartment was small enough that she could cross from the bedroom to the kitchen in 9 steps. She knew because she had counted once during a night she couldn't sleep, which was most nights, and the number had stuck with her the way useless things did when you were running on fumes. 9 steps. That was her world. That and Noah's room at the end of the short hallway, where she paused now with her hand on the doorframe and listened to him breathe. He breathed differently than other kids. Slower. There was a slight catch in it, just barely audible, like a hinge that needed oiling. The cardiologist called it a compensatory rhythm. Emery called it the sound that woke her up at 3 in the morning, even before the alarm. Even on nights when she had only been asleep for 2 hours, because some part of her nervous system had rewired itself around that sound and would not let her fully go under until she heard it. She listened. The catch. The slow exhale. She let her own breath out. Noah was fine. Noah was sleeping. Noah had a field trip tomorrow, and she had signed the permission slip and paid the $4 fee 3 weeks ago because she had learned early that the worst thing you could do as a broke parent was let your kid be the one who couldn't go on the field trip. That specific humiliation had a weight to it. She understood too well from her own childhood. And she had decided before Noah was even born that he would not carry that. She made coffee. She drank it standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like surrender, and she had 11 minutes before she needed to leave for the cafe. Emery was 31 years old. She had a face that people described as striking when she was rested, which meant they described it as tired most of the time, because she was tired most of the time. Her hair was dark and she wore it pulled back so tightly it doubled as a headache. She had a burn scar on her left forearm from a grease accident during her 3rd week at the restaurant 3 years ago, and she had never had the time or money to see about it properly, so it had healed rough. She noticed it sometimes when she changed uniforms between jobs, this raw seam of skin, and she thought of it as a kind of record-keeping. Evidence of the math. Here's what it costs. Here's what it looks like on the body. She left the apartment at 4:26. The street outside was empty and wet from overnight rain, and the streetlights made everything look vaguely orange, like a photograph that hadn't developed right. She walked fast. She always walked fast because there was a 22-minute window between leaving this door and opening the cafe door, and she could not miss it because the owner, a 60-year-old Guatemalan woman named Solia, who had given Emery the job when no one else would, trusted her with the keys. And breaking that trust was not something Emery was capable of contemplating. The cafe was called Hazel's, though there had never been a Hazel. Solia had bought it from someone who named it and never bothered to change the sign because the sign was fine and signs cost money. It was a small neighborhood place, 6 tables, a counter, a pastry case that Emery stocked every morning from bakery boxes delivered at 4:45. She opened the door, switched on the lights, started the espresso machine, and began the particular sequence of small tasks that made up the first 2 hours of her day before the first customer walked in at 6, and the machine of it all started grinding. She liked this part, actually, liked the quiet of it. The cafe before people was the only version of silence she got that didn't feel like deprivation. It felt like preparation, which was different. She could think here, or not think, which was better. She thought about Noah's heart. She thought about it the way you thought about a thing you weren't supposed to think about, constantly, peripherally, in the white space around every other thought. Dr. Anand had said it again last month, gently, in that way doctors got gentle when what they were saying was expensive. The valve wasn't getting better on its own. At some point, not yet, but at some point, they were going to need to talk about intervention, about surgery. The word sat in Emery's chest like a stone she'd swallowed and couldn't pass. She pulled a tray of blueberry scones from a box and arranged them in the pastry case, and did not let herself finish the calculation about what surgery would cost, because finishing that calculation led nowhere. She could afford to go at 4:50 in the morning. The first shift ended at 11. She took the bus home, changed into the gray and white housekeeping uniform, ate a piece of bread standing over the kitchen sink, and took the bus back out. The hotel was a mid-range chain near the convention center. She had a cart. She had a quota. She cleaned 14 rooms on a good day, 16 on a bad one, which meant a bad day was when people left the rooms worse than usual, and she had to work faster to stay on schedule. She had learned to move through those rooms like water, efficient and impersonal, her mind somewhere else while her hands did the work. Her mind was usually with Noah. He was at school during her hotel shift. She had arranged it so she finished the hotel by 3:15 on most days, which gave her 45 minutes to pick him up from aftercare, walk him home, oversee the homework, and reheat whatever she had meal prepped Sunday night before the third job started at 5. The timing was a mechanism. She maintained it the way you maintained a car you couldn't afford to replace, obsessively, preemptively, with the constant low-grade awareness that any single thing breaking down would break everything. Tonight it was the restaurant. It was always the restaurant on Tuesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday, which were the nights the tips were good enough to justify the $12 bus fare and the 6 hours on her feet and the particular variety of invisible labor required to be pleasant and capable and invisible to people who were paying primarily to be made comfortable. Luciano's was upscale Italian, the kind of place where the wine list was longer than the menu and the lighting was designed to make everyone look a little better than they actually were. Emery had been working there for 2 years. She was good at it in a technical sense. She could carry 3 plates and remember a 6 tops modifications without writing them down and read a table well enough to know when they wanted conversation and when they wanted to be left alone. The other servers liked her because she didn't steal tables and she always covered her own section. The manager, a compact, humorless man named Felix, liked her because she never called in sick. She had called in sick exactly once in 2 years, when Noah had the flu and she had no one. She had not been sick. Noah had been sick. She had sat on the bathroom floor next to him all night while he threw up, and then she had called Felix at 6 in the morning and he had said fine, but said it in a way that meant not fine, and she had understood and not let it happen again. The Tuesday night crowd was medium, not empty, not slammed, the comfortable middle where she could breathe and still make decent money. She had table 4, a deuce celebrating some kind of anniversary. Table 7, a 4-top of business guys doing expense account dining. Table 11, empty. Table 12, a woman alone with a book who would nurse a single glass of Pinot Grigio for 2 hours and tip 20%, which Emery had come to think of as the solid citizen of restaurant customers. She was between the kitchen and table 7 with a bread basket at 8:17 when she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the air pressure of the room. The particular way a space gets when something happens to it, when the nature of the room alters before the people in it have processed what they're reacting to. She had felt it once before, years ago, standing outside a building the moment before someone drove a car into the lobby, and she had never forgotten the specific quality of that silence, the held breath of it. She came out of the kitchen and looked toward the front. The convoy was already there. 3 black SUVs at the curb, 2 more behind them, visible through the plate glass of the front window. Men in dark suits moved through the entrance with the coordinated efficiency of people who secured spaces for a living, and Felix was standing near the host stand with the expression of someone who had been spoken to in a language they didn't know and was deciding how to respond. Then the door opened again, and the room went quiet. The way rooms go quiet when something irreversible walks in. Emery was holding a breadbasket. She was aware of this fact with strange clarity because her hand tightened on it until the wicker dug into her palm, And even later, she would remember the physical fact of that, the wicker, the palm, the way her body registered what her mind hadn't caught up to yet. Dante Vescari. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she had allowed herself to make him smaller over time, one of those unconscious edits the memory makes to help you survive something. He wore a dark suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who had always been expensive, and his hair was shorter than it used to be, and there was a scar she didn't recognize running through his left eyebrow that hadn't been there 8 years ago. He moved through the room with the particular quality of a man who had never once in his adult life been the person who had to move around other people. The room moved around him. It did so automatically, without his asking. She couldn't move. Her feet had simply stopped participating. The breadbasket hung from her hand. She was aware that she was staring, and that staring was the worst possible thing she could do, and she could not stop doing it. One of the security men was talking quietly to Felix. A table was being rearranged near the back. A foretop cleared of its seated couple, who were being relocated with an apology and a complimentary bottle of something, and the particular mixture of irritation and excitement that came from being displaced by someone important. Dante hadn't looked her way yet. He was speaking to the man beside him, something low and brief, and the man was nodding. His eyes were moving across the room in a professional sweep, the kind of scan that took in the space and the exits and the variables, and then they crossed the room and landed on her and stopped. The world narrowed to a point. She watched him recognize her, watched the specific process of it, the initial data landing, the pause, the adjustment, the second look that wasn't uncertainty but confirmation. His face didn't change in any dramatic way, which was almost worse than if it had. He had learned to control his face, she realized. Learned it in whatever life he had built in the years since he'd vanished from hers, and the face he wore now was the face of a man who had needed that skill badly enough to acquire it. But his body stopped. Just for a second. One half beat of complete stillness before the training reasserted itself. And Emery, who had spent 8 years trying to learn that same stillness, felt it crack open in her own chest like something old and sealed finally giving way. She took a breath. She made herself look away. She made herself walk to table 7 and set down the breadbasket and say, "Sorry for the wait," with a voice that came out even, and she stood there with her back to the room while one of the business guys said something about the sauce, and she said, "Absolutely, I'll let the kitchen know." And then she walked, not fast, steady, measured, toward the service corridor. She made it 12 steps into the back hallway before her legs stopped working right. She put her hand on the wall. Tile. Cold. She focused on that. Cold tile. Fluorescent hum. The smell of the industrial cleaner they used on the floors back here. Bleach and something fake floral underneath it. 8 years. He had been dead. She had decided he was dead because the alternative, that he had chosen to leave, that the last night she saw him had simply been the last night, was something she could not have survived intact. And she had needed to survive intact because 3 months after he disappeared, she had found out she was pregnant, and intact was no longer optional. It was the only available mode. She had raised Noah on the assumption that his father was a man who existed only in her memory and in the particular shape of the boy's eyes and the way he tilted his head when he was thinking hard. She pressed her palm flat against the tile and breathed. Then she heard Felix's voice at the end of the hallway, tight and professional. "Holloway, table 6 needs bussing before the party moves over." She pushed off the wall. She straightened her back. She walked back out. He was seated now. His security had taken the adjacent tables, drinks already in front of them, their eyes moving across the room in steady rotations. Dante sat with 2 other men. One she didn't know, one she recognized from a photograph she had once seen in a newspaper article, though she couldn't remember when or why she'd been reading about him. And he was looking at the menu, or appearing to look at the menu, because as Emery crossed the dining room toward the busing station, she could feel the quality of his attention the way you felt weather, not precisely visible, but present against the skin. She was loading glasses onto the busing tray when the voice came from directly behind her. "Emery." One word, her name in his mouth, the specific way he had always said it, not soft, not hard, just particular, like the word was a specific address and not a general one. She took one more second, set the glass down, turned around. He was standing close enough that she had to look up, which she resented and which he probably knew. Behind him, at a careful distance, one of his men had shifted slightly on his chair. Not toward them, just oriented, alert. "Dante?" Her voice came out flat, not hostile, not warm, somewhere in the territory of managed. He looked at her for a long moment, and she looked back, and somewhere in the distance a table was laughing at something, and the kitchen sent up a clatter of pans, and the room was absolutely full of the ordinary sounds of other people having an ordinary night. "You work here," he said. Not a question. Stating it, the way you stated something when saying it out loud, was the only way to make it feel real. "I work a lot of places," she said. Something moved through his expression. There and gone. "How long?" 2 years, at this one." "At this one," he repeated, quiet. "Was there something you needed?" she said. "For your table." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not—" He stopped. Started again, lower. "I need you to talk to me. I'm working. I know you're working." "Then you know this isn't the time." He held her eyes. The control on his face was formidable, but there was something underneath it that she recognized. Not from the man he was now, but from the boy he'd been. The specific way he'd looked when he was trying to contain something he felt strongly and struggling with the containing. That look was still there. Older, but there. "Is he mine?" Dante said. The room didn't stop. The room had no idea. The business guys were arguing about something. The anniversary couple was sharing a dessert. The woman with the book had turned a page. Emery looked at Dante Viscari, and she thought about 4 years of minimum wage jobs before she got the cafe shift. She thought about the first time Noah was hospitalized at age 2, that particular 48 hours that had reordered everything she thought she knew about fear. She thought about the permission slip, the $4 field trip fee, the wicker digging into her palm. "His name," she said, "is Noah." And she turned and walked back toward the kitchen and did not let herself shake until she hit the hallway. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps following, no voice calling her name again. Just the room, doing what rooms did, full of people who had no idea that the entire architecture of at least 2 lives had just shifted on its foundation. She stood in the hallway, with her hand against the cold tile again, and this time she let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just said. "His name is Noah." She hadn't said no. She hadn't said he isn't yours. She had given Dante Viscari the name of her son, and she was still standing here with her back against the wall trying to understand what had possessed her to do that when she heard it. The shift in noise from the dining room. Not the usual shift, something faster. One of Dante's men moving, chairs scraping back, and then another sound underneath that, outside through the plate glass, tires on wet asphalt, fast, and then the sharp, intrusive brightness of high beams flooding the front window. The first shot came through the glass before anyone in the dining room had fully stood up. The shot took out the front window in a single implosion of glass that sounded less like breaking and more like the room inhaling sharply. And then the dining room was noise. Chairs overturning, a woman screaming somewhere near the back, Felix shouting something into his earpiece that he didn't have. Because Felix didn't have an earpiece, Felix was a restaurant manager, and the surreal wrongness of that detail hit Emery even as she was already moving. Dante's men moved faster than she would have thought possible for men sitting in chairs. By the time the second shot came, higher, punching through the wall above the host stand and sending plaster dust into the air like a small gray cloud, 3 of them had already produced weapons she hadn't known they were carrying, and the 4th had overturned 2 of the heavy wooden tables to form a barrier across the middle of the restaurant. The coordinated speed of it was terrifying in a specific way, the way a machine was terrifying when you realized it had been designed for exactly this, and had been waiting quietly to demonstrate that fact. Emery was on the floor. She didn't remember deciding to get on the floor. Her body had made that decision without consulting her, and she was crouched between the service corridor entrance and the busing station, with her back against the wall and her palms flat on the tile that was now covered in a thin layer of broken glass. She hadn't heard land. She could see under the overturned tables. She could see feet. Dark shoes moving with purpose, Dante's men spreading across the room. The anniversary couple was under their table, the woman's face pressed into the man's shoulder. The business guys had scattered, two of them flat on the ground near the bar, one behind the bar itself. The woman with the book was gone. She had been closest to the back exit, and she was apparently the kind of person who moved when she needed to move, which Emery noted somewhere in the back of her mind as something to aspire to. Then Dante was there. Not across the room. Right there, crouched beside her in the narrow space next to the busing station, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him and hear his breathing, which was controlled in a way that made her own breathing feel embarrassingly ragged by comparison. "Are you hit?" he said. Not asked. Said, "The way you checked off a variable." "No." "Stay down. Stay against the wall. Don't move toward the windows." "I wasn't planning to move toward the windows." He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Something complicated lived in that look. Relief, and something harder, something older. Then he turned back toward the room, and she could see him processing information the way she'd seen people process information in emergencies, fast and sequential, his eyes moving across the space with a flatness that she recognized now as the professional version of the fear that ordinary people felt. The shooting had stopped. That was worse, somehow, than if it had continued. One of Dante's men, big, wide-shouldered, with a face like weathered concrete, appeared at a low crouch from behind the table barrier and said one word to Dante. Emery didn't catch it. Dante responded with 2 words she didn't catch either, and the man disappeared back toward the front. Outside, she could hear engines, not leaving, positioning. "How many exits?" Dante said, and it took her a second to realize he was asking her. "Kitchen has a back door onto the alley. Employee entrance on the side, but it opens onto the cross street." She paused. "The alley connects to the parking structure 2 blocks east." He looked at her again, and this time the look was different. "You clocked that." "I clock every exit in every building I work in," she said. "I have a kid." His jaw moved. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "The kitchen exit, is it alarmed?" "It trips if you don't enter the code, but I know the code." He made a decision. She could see it happen, the way a current moved through him and settled into something resolved. "We go through the kitchen. You lead." "I'm not going anywhere until I call Emery." His voice was low and absolutely level, and there was something in the sound of it that had not been there 8 years ago, a quality of someone who had given orders that cost lives and had learned to live with that. "The people outside are not here for the restaurant. They are here for me. Every second we stay in this room, you are in direct danger. So we are going to move, and you are going to lead us through the kitchen, and we will talk about everything else after." She looked at him. She thought about Noah asleep 7 blocks away, the slight catch in his breathing, the signed permission slip on the counter for the field trip tomorrow. She got up. "Follow me," she said. The kitchen was controlled chaos. 2 line cooks were flat on the floor behind the prep station. One of them had his phone out and was on with emergency services. The expeditor, a young guy named Marcus who had worked there longer than Emery, was standing against the far wall with his hands at his sides and his face the color of old chalk. "Marcus." She kept her voice even. "Back door, I need the alarm code." "Emery, what the hell is—" "The code, Marcus." He stared at the 4 men moving through his kitchen with weapons drawn and then back at Emery, and something in her face apparently communicated the specific nature of the situation because he said 7741 and pressed himself flatter against the wall. She moved to the back door, entered the code. The small panel blinked green and she pushed the door open into the alley, cold air hitting her face, wet asphalt smell. The distant sound of sirens already working their way toward this neighborhood from somewhere north. The alley was empty, narrow, lined with dumpsters, lit badly from a single fixture above the adjacent restaurant's back entrance. She went through first and held the door, and Dante's men came out in a specific order. 1 first, sweeping, then 2 more flanking, then Dante himself, and then the last one backward through the door watching the kitchen. The concussion hit her. Not close, half a block away maybe, out on the main street, but big enough that she felt it in her sternum, and the alley lit up briefly orange and then dark again, and somewhere ahead of them a car alarm started screaming. Dante's hand found her arm. Not grabbing, exactly, more like he had calculated the exact amount of pressure that constituted guidance rather than force. "Move," he said quietly. "East." They moved east. She led them through the alley, around a corner, through a gap between two buildings that led out onto the side street, and then the parking structure was visible. Its entrance, a concrete mouth 200 feet ahead. She was wearing restaurant shoes, pratik, non-slip, practical, and she was moving fast enough that she could feel the cold air cutting into her lungs and the sweat on the back of her neck going icy. They made the structure. The ground floor was half full of cars, the overhead lights flickering with the particular indifference of municipal infrastructure. Dante's lead man was already on a phone, speaking fast and low in a language she didn't recognize. They stopped between a concrete pillar and a row of parked cars. Emery turned around. Her heart was slamming. She let it slam. She had learned to function through her heart slamming years ago. Dante was watching her. "Someone needs to tell me what just happened," she said. "A competing organization. They've been pushing for 3 weeks." He said it the way you gave a weather report. Matter of fact. Like people shooting through restaurant windows was a meteorological event. "In my restaurant." "Yes." "With civilians. They don't make the distinctions you might hope they would." He paused. "Are you injured?" "I'm asking again because people often don't notice until the adrenaline—" "I'm not injured." She pulled her arm back. She hadn't realized he was still holding it until she moved and felt the absence. "I need to call my neighbor. I need to make sure Noah is— I need to call." "Call." She already had her phone out. The neighbor was a 53-year-old woman named Greta who had a key and who Emery had a standing arrangement with for exactly these kinds of contingencies, though the contingencies she had imagined were more along the lines of a delayed bus or a missed last train, and considerably less along the lines of an active shooter situation in an Italian restaurant. Greta answered on the second ring, voice thick with sleep, and Emery said, in a voice so steady it surprised even herself, "I'm okay, but I need you to go check on Noah right now and stay with him until I'm home. Don't answer the door for anyone. I'll explain everything." There was a pause, and then Greta said, "I'm already moving," which was one of those moments that made Emery realize she had surrounded herself with precisely the right people, even when she hadn't been conscious of doing it. She hung up. She turned back to Dante. Behind him, his men had fanned out around the perimeter of their position, watching the ramps. "You need to tell me things," she said. "Yes." Not the short version. Something shifted in his face. Not softened. That was the wrong word for it. Unlocked, maybe. Like something that had been held in tension had been released, just barely. "I know. Start with where you went." The silence between that sentence and his response lasted long enough that she felt it the way you felt a physical thing, a pressure against the skin. "I didn't go," he said finally. "I was taken." She stared at him. "What?" "My father, his people." His voice was flat, but it had the flatness of something deliberately pressed down. "I was 24. We had been together, you and I, Shiki, for 8 months. My father had made his position clear, on you, on us. I had made mine clear back." He paused. He resolved the disagreement in the way he resolved most disagreements. "He had you. 3 men. A car park in Riverdale. I woke up in a facility outside the city that I later learned had been used primarily for the storage of inconvenient people." He held her eyes, and she saw, just underneath the flatness, the thing that flatness was being used to contain. "It took me 11 months to get out. By the time I was free, I had been informed, credibly with documentation I could not immediately disprove, that you had taken a settlement from my father and left the city." The parking structure hummed around them. A car moved on an upper level, headlights briefly swinging across the ceiling above them. "A settlement," Emery said. "Yes." "I never spoke to your father." "I know that now. I never took anything from anyone. I was 19 and pregnant, and I had $40, and I thought you were dead because I—" She stopped. Started again, lower. "The police told me you'd been in an accident, off a bridge on the west side, no body recovered. They said sometimes the current—" She stopped again. Dante was very still. "Your father told them to tell me that," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He manufactured a death. He manufactured several things. He was very good at that. He said it without inflection, and she understood that whatever he felt about his father was not something that lived near the surface anymore. It had been moved somewhere internal and load-bearing, the way old damage became structural. He's been dead for 4 years. I found out about the settlement story 6 months after that. It took me time to... He stopped. To find me. He held her gaze. To find you. She thought about 19 years old. She thought about sitting in a public health clinic waiting room with a number on a slip of paper, and the specific weight of being utterly alone in a way that had a physical mass to it. She thought about all the iterations of that weight across 7 years, and she felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief move through her chest and settle somewhere at the base of her throat. "You should have found me faster," she said. The words came out quiet, not accusing. She was too tired for accusation in its dramatic form. Just true. The way things were true when they were simply facts and the time for softening them had long passed. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Yes." One of his men appeared at the edge of their position and said something brief. Dante answered and then looked back at her. "We need to move again. They'll have the street locked down in 20 minutes, and I need you somewhere safe before that." He paused. "I have a secured location, 15 minutes from here. I need you to come with us. I need to get to Noah. Your neighbor is with him. He is safer there right now than he would be moving through the streets with us. Don't tell me what's safe for my son." "Emery." Something cracked through his voice just slightly, like a seam giving under pressure. "I am not telling you what to feel. I am asking you to let me protect you for the next 2 hours while we get off the street, and then I will take you wherever you need to go. I am asking." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the scar through his eyebrow that she didn't know the story of yet. She looked at the way he held himself, upright but not easy. There was nothing easy about it. And she thought about 11 months in a facility, and 4 years of not knowing, and 6 months of searching, and she thought about what it cost a person to become something like this, whatever this was, and she felt nothing simple about any of it. 2 hours, she said. The secured location was a building in a part of the city that Emery had never had reason to be in, a converted industrial space with reinforced doors and no signage, the kind of building that communicated nothing to the street. Inside it was different, austere, clean, functional, the kind of space designed by someone who understood that real security was structural and not decorative. They went through a series of rooms to a space that had a table, chairs, windows that were clearly not standard glass, and a man Emery hadn't seen before sitting at a laptop who looked up when they entered and looked back down without visible reaction, which she found oddly calming. Dante said something to the man, who nodded and closed the laptop and left. They were alone. She sat down because her legs had been making their feelings about the evening known for the past 30 minutes, and she had been ignoring them with diminishing success. She sat, and she put her hands flat on the table and she looked at them. Her hands, scarred forearm, the smudge of what might be flour from the morning's cafe shift still caught in the skin near her wrist, and she let the silence be for a moment. Dante remained standing. He had taken off his jacket, and the shirt underneath was dark enough that she couldn't see if he was carrying anything. He was watching her with that contained attention that had become his resting state, or maybe always had been, and she just hadn't known it then because she had been 19, and he had been able to show her a different face, the face of someone not yet fully formed into what necessity was going to make him. "Noah has a heart condition," she said. The air changed. "How serious?" he said. Serious enough that I think about it every night when I'm trying to sleep." She met his eyes. "He needs surgery. I don't have the money for surgery. I'm working 3 jobs and I don't have the money for surgery." She said it plainly, without apology and without theater, because she was too exhausted for either and because she wanted him to hear it exactly as it was, stripped of everything except its factual weight. Dante's expression did something she couldn't fully read. A compaction, maybe. Something being pressed inward with considerable force. "Tell me what he needs," he said quietly. "What he needs is a father who was actually there," she said, and she heard the flatness in her own voice and recognized it as the flatness she'd heard in his earlier, the instrument of a person pressing something down. What he's going to get is a surgery he doesn't know he needs yet, because I haven't figured out how to tell a 7-year-old that his heart isn't working right. She paused. He thinks you're dead. I told him you died. I know that was... She breathed. I know. You did what you had to do, Dante said. Don't tell me what I did. I know what I did. I'm telling you because it's information you need, not because I want your absolution. He sat down then, across the table from her, which put them in the specific geometry of two people in a room without anywhere else to be, and the weight of everything they hadn't said yet sat between them like a physical substance. I've been having you watched, he said, since the restaurant, since I recognized you. She felt a cold thread move through her chest. Excuse me. Not... He stopped. I needed to understand your situation before I made any approach. I had people find out about your jobs, your building, Noah's school. He held her gaze and didn't flinch from it. His medical records. I know about Dr. Anand. I know about the valve. I know about the estimate. The cold thread became something more systemic. She sat very still. You had someone access my son's medical records. Yes. Without my knowledge. Yes. She stood up. It wasn't a dramatic movement. There was no energy in her for dramatic movements at this hour, after this night, but it was absolute. She stood up and she looked at him and she said, That is my child. My child. Not a variable in whatever calculation you're running. I know. No, you don't know. You don't know what it cost me to build a life around that child. You don't know what he is. You have his medical records, which means you have data. Data is not the same as knowing. Her voice stayed flat through all of it. She had learned that from years of talking to people in authority, landlords, doctors, social workers, who responded to tears with discomfort and to controlled delivery with attention. And now you're going to sit there and tell me what else you've done without asking me. A beat. I bought the building, he said. She went very still. What building? The building you live in. Your apartment. It was sold to a property management company 8 weeks ago. I acquired the company 3 weeks ago. He said it with the same even quality he'd used to describe everything else, but his eyes were watching her with a care that contradicted the tone. You won't be evicted. The rent won't increase. The sound she made wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite anything else. It was the sound of something under too much pressure finding the nearest available exit. You bought my building, she said. Yes? My building that I live in, my home. I couldn't. For the first time, something stuttered in his delivery. You were going to lose it. Your landlord was planning to convert to, I know what my landlord was planning. I know because I have been managing that situation for 4 months. She looked at him across the table. Dante, what you have done is decide on my behalf, without my knowledge, what my life needs. That is what your father did. To both of us. The silence that followed that sentence was the loudest thing in the room. She watched him absorb it, watched the specific quality of being hit by something true. Not the impact of a surprise, but the impact of recognition, which was worse. His jaw moved. He looked down at the table and then back up. You're right, he said quietly. I know I am. She sat back down, because her legs were still having opinions, and she was tired enough now that she had to make choices about which battles to fight with her own body. I'm also still here. So, he looked at her across the table, and in the quiet of the room, with the residue of glass and gunfire, and 8 years of mutual damage still settling around them, something shifted between them. Not resolved. Nothing was resolved, but different. The particular difference of two people who had finally started talking in the same language after years of speaking at cross purposes through walls of manufactured lies. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Greta. She answered immediately. Emery. Greta's voice was careful in a way that activated every alarm in Emery's system simultaneously. A man came to the building. He didn't knock on the door. He was in the hallway, looking at Noah's room window from outside. A pause. I called the police, but I think you should know. Noah's fine. He's asleep. But Emery... Another pause. The man, he had something. A photograph. He dropped it when I opened the window to shout at him. It fell to the street and I went down and it was a photograph of Noah. At school. With today's the photograph. Emery's hand tightened around the phone until she could feel the edges of the case pressing into her palm. What was today's date on it? She said, and her voice was so controlled that it frightened her a little, the way a guardrail frightened you when you were close enough to touch it. Today's, Greta said. Emery, it was taken today. At the school. He's in his blue jacket, the one he wore this morning. The room was very quiet. Dante was watching her face, and she watched him read it, and she watched him stand up from the table before she had even finished processing what she needed to say. Stay with him, she told Greta. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone except me. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up. She looked at Dante. Someone photographed Noah today, she said. At school. And left the photograph at my building tonight. The transformation that moved through Dante Viscari in the following 3 seconds was something she would remember for a long time. Not dramatic. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move suddenly. It was more like watching a temperature drop. Something internal that had been running at a regulated level shifted downward into something colder and more fundamental. And the man who had been sitting across from her talking about buildings and medical records and the shape of their shared past became, in the space of those 3 seconds, something different. Something that had not been built for conversation. He crossed to the door and spoke through it in a low, rapid sequence that brought 2 of his men into the room immediately. She stood. I'm going to my son. Yes, he said, not arguing, moving. We're going together. She started to say something about the nature of we and what she had and hadn't agreed to, but she looked at his face and she understood that this particular argument would cost time she didn't have, and she let it go and followed him out. The drive took 14 minutes. She counted them. She sat in the back of one of the black SUVs with Dante beside her, and the city moving past the windows, and she kept her eyes on her phone, on Greta's last message. We're okay. Door locked. And she breathed in a deliberate and mechanical way, the way she had learned to breathe during Noah's first hospitalization, when a nurse had quietly taken her outside the room and said, You cannot fall apart in there, so let's do it out here for 60 seconds, and had stood with her while she did, and then walked her back in. She did that now, 60 seconds. In the back of a car belonging to a man she'd loved at 19 and lost and found again across the barrel of a situation she still didn't fully understand. 60 seconds of controlled falling apart, and then she put it away and looked at Dante. The people who took the photograph, she said, they knew to look for Noah. Yes. Which means they know who he is. Yes. Which means they know about us. About before. He looked out the window for a moment. The information about Noah's parentage, that would have required access to things that aren't public, records, the investigation I ran when I was looking for you. His voice was tight but even. Someone accessed that information and used it. Someone inside your organization. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She looked at the side of his face and felt something cold and clear settle through her, the specific clarity that came when fear stopped being general and became directional. You have a problem inside your own house, she said. It's being addressed. It's being addressed, she repeated, like the restaurant tonight was being addressed. Like the convoy and the gunfight and the photograph of my 7-year-old were all things being addressed. She turned away from him and looked out her own window. Your problems keep becoming my son's problems, Dante. He had nothing to say to that. She hadn't expected him to. They reached the building at 11:43. His men did a perimeter check that took 3 minutes and involved a level of systematic thoroughness that Emery observed with the unsettled feeling of someone learning that the danger had always been more serious than she'd been equipped to understand. Then they went up. Greta opened the door before Emery knocked. The older woman looked at Emery, then at Dante, then at the man who had taken a position in the hallway outside, and her expression went through 3 distinct phases in approximately 2 seconds before settling on a kind of deliberate composure that Emery had always respected in her. He's still asleep, Greta said quietly. Didn't wake through any of it. Thank you. Emery put her hand briefly on Greta's arm. I'm serious. Thank you. The photograph is on the counter. Greta said it to Emery, but she was looking at Dante when she said it. Then she left, pulling the door closed behind her with a soft precision that communicated her feelings about the situation more clearly than speech would have. The photograph was a 4x6 print, standard paper, the kind produced by any drugstore photo kiosk. It showed Noah in his blue jacket, standing in a group of kids outside what was clearly his school's entrance. He was looking slightly to the left, his face caught in a half profile, and the shot had the quality of something taken from a distance, with a long lens. Not casual, purposeful framing. Noah was in the center of the image. Dante looked at it for a long time. He was standing at the kitchen counter, and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at the photograph of his son with an expression that Emery didn't have a name for. It wasn't the controlled flatness he'd worn through most of the evening. It wasn't anything she could catalog. "Keep it," she said. "Give it to whoever needs it." One of his men took the photograph in a gloved hand. She noticed the gloves and noticed that she had not seen them produce gloves until this moment, which meant the gloves had been anticipated, and placed it in a small evidence bag that appeared from somewhere. Emery went to Noah's room. She stood in the doorway the way she always did, the catch in his breathing, the slow exhale, the blue jacket hanging on the hook on the back of his door, the one from the photograph, and she looked at it and felt a rage so clean and cold it was almost clarifying. Someone had looked at her son through a long lens today. Someone had framed him in a viewfinder and pressed a shutter and printed the image and walked to her building and left it like a calling card, and the message of it was not subtle. "We know where he is. We can reach him whenever we want." She pulled Noah's door to, not fully closed, and went back into the main room. Dante was on the phone. Brief, controlled. He ended the call and looked at her. "My security lead is pulling the school's external camera footage from today. We'll have a face within the hour." "And then what?" "And then we handle it." "I'm going to need you to define handle." He looked at her steadily. "The people who sent that photograph are the same people who sent men through your restaurant window tonight. They will not stop with photographs." She already knew this. She had known it the moment Greta said today's date. She had known it in the way that you knew things you wished you didn't know, with a full-body recognition that left no room for productive denial. "Noah has a field trip tomorrow," she said. The silence landed hard. "Cancel it," Dante said. "He's been looking forward to it for 3 weeks. He made me check the permission slip twice to make sure I'd signed it." "Emery, I know." She cut him off, not harshly, just decisively, because she knew what she was about to say and she needed to say it without his voice in the middle of it. "I know it needs to be canceled. I know that. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what this is costing. Every time something gets canceled or moved or locked down, he loses something. He's 7. He doesn't have a surplus of things." She paused. "So yes, we cancel the field trip, and I need to be the one to tell him." Dante was very still. "Understood," he said. They worked through the next 2 hours in a state of grim functionality, the way people worked through emergencies when the emergency wasn't over, but had entered a phase that required management rather than reaction. Dante's people took up positions that she tried to think of as precautionary, rather than as evidence that her apartment was now an armed camp. She changed out of her restaurant uniform, the last of the 3 she'd worn that day, and she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't taste while Dante sat across from her, and they went through what he knew about the rival organization, which was more than she wanted to know and less than she needed. The faction was called the Serrano Network. They had been moving against Dante's operations for the better part of a year, primarily through economic pressure and the occasional surgical violence, the kind designed to send messages rather than cause catastrophic damage. Tonight had been a departure from that pattern. Tonight had been loud and public and deeply reckless. "Why the escalation?" she said. "They've been losing ground. When you start losing, you start taking risks you wouldn't normally take." "And Noah," he held her eyes. "Using a child changes the nature of what we're dealing with. They know that. They're doing it because they're out of cleaner options." She thought about that. She thought about the architecture of a situation where her son was a cleaner option. She drank her tea and she said nothing for a long moment. "Your man on the inside," she said, "the one who leaked Noah's information." Dante's expression shifted slightly. "Have you identified him?" "We have a narrowed field," he said carefully. "That's not a yes." No, he said, it's not. She set down her cup. So right now, inside your organization, there is someone who sold information about my son to people who put his photograph through my door. And you don't know exactly who it is. Not yet. Which means they still have access. Their access has been restricted pending Dante. She said his name the way she'd said it in the restaurant hallway, flat and direct. Is my son safe in this apartment tonight? The pause before he answered was a fraction too long. My men are outside, he said. That isn't what I asked. He looked at her across the table and his face was doing the pressing down thing again, the containment, and she looked at him and waited, and finally he said, I want to move you somewhere more controlled. You want to move us? Yes, tonight. There's a property in Westchester. It's secure, it's comfortable, I have 3 jobs tomorrow. I know. If I don't show up to the cafe, Solia will lose her morning opening. She depends on me specifically because she trusts me specifically, and I am not going to. I'll have someone contact. You will not contact my employer. She felt the cold clarity again, the directional fear becoming something else, something that had less to do with fear and more to do with the fundamental question of who controlled what. You have already bought my building without telling me. You have already accessed my son's medical records without telling me. You are not going to make decisions about my employment. He leaned forward slightly. Emery, people with guns were in your restaurant tonight. There is a photograph of your son on your kitchen counter. I am trying to protect you. I understand what you're trying to do. She held his gaze. I understand it comes from something real. I'm telling you that the method is not acceptable and the method is what we're negotiating right now, not the intention. He sat back. He rubbed his hand across his jaw, and she heard the rasp of it, and she noticed, with the peripheral awareness of someone who had spent the whole night noticing things they didn't want to notice, that his hand was not entirely steady. That steadied her, somehow. Tell me what you'll accept, he said quietly. I'll accept your people in the building tonight. I'll accept a conversation tomorrow about longer-term arrangements, a real conversation, where I have input and you don't present me with things you've already done. She paused. And I'll accept you being here, tonight. Not because She stopped. Because Noah knows something is wrong. He wakes up sometimes and comes to the kitchen, and if he comes tonight and there are strangers here, I want there to also be... She stopped again. Someone he knows, Dante said. Someone he's going to have to get to know, she said. Eventually. On terms that I control. But someone. Dante nodded once. Okay, he said. That was all. Just, okay. She showed him where the extra blankets were, and she went to bed, and she lay in the dark and listened to Noah breathe through the wall, and she did not sleep for a very long time. At some point in the early hours, she heard Dante moving quietly in the kitchen, and she lay there listening to the small sounds of another person existing in her space, the careful opening of a cabinet, the low run of the tap. And she thought about how strange it was that 8 years of absence could produce something like this. A man she had once loved moving through her kitchen in the dark, a child sleeping down the hall who had his eyes, and the entire weight of a night that had started with a breadbasket and ended with an armed perimeter around a 7-year-old's apartment. She slept eventually. 2 hours, maybe less. The morning came in gray and cold, and Noah's alarm went off at 7:15, and she heard him padding to the bathroom with the slightly uneven gait he had when he was still half asleep, and she got up and went to the kitchen and started coffee, and she heard him stop in the hallway behind her and go very still. She turned around. Noah was standing in the hallway entrance in his pajamas, blue, printed with small dinosaurs, an irony she had never entirely gotten over, staring at the large man asleep on her couch with his jacket folded under his head, and his shoes still on. Then Noah looked at her with the particular expression of a 7-year-old processing a significant deviation from established norms. "Mom," he said very quietly. "Morning, Bug. There is a man on our couch. I see him, yes. He's very big. He is, yeah." Noah looked at the man, then back at her, then at the man again, with the focused attention of someone conducting a serious evaluation. "Is he nice?" he said. Before she could answer, Dante's eyes opened. He didn't startle. He He went from asleep to awake without the usual transition, which she filed away as another item in the growing catalog of things about him that were the product of a life she didn't know yet. He looked at the ceiling for 1 second, and then he turned his head and he saw Noah. The expression on Dante Vescari's face in that moment was something Emery was not prepared for. All the containment, all the controlled flatness, all the deliberate management of surface, gone. Just gone. Replaced by something so unguarded it was almost painful to witness. He looked at the boy in the dinosaur pajamas, and his whole face changed, and he looked, briefly, exactly like the 24-year-old she had loved 8 years ago, before everything. Noah looked back at him with grave, unblinking 7-year-old assessment. "Hi," Noah said. "Hi," Dante said. His voice came out slightly rough, which Emery suspected had nothing to do with sleep. "Are you my mom's friend?" A beat. "Yes," Dante said. Noah absorbed this. "Okay," he said, with the pragmatism of a child who had grown up understanding that the world was complicated and most questions were answered slowly. He turned back to Emery. "Can I have cereal?" "Yeah, Bug, go sit down." She made Noah's cereal, and she made Dante coffee without being asked, and she stood at the counter and she thought about how she was going to explain the field trip, and she thought about the photograph, and she thought about the Serrano network, and then she thought about none of those things, because her phone buzzed with an unknown number, and she looked at it, and something in her chest went very cold. She showed the screen to Dante. The text message read, "We have a common problem. There is something you need to know about Vescari before it's too late. Meet me, alone. I'll find you." Dante looked at the message, his jaw set hard. "Don't respond." "Someone inside your organization contacted me directly," she said quietly. Noah at the table behind them with his cereal, oblivious. "Which means someone inside your organization has my number." "Yes." "Which is the same person who leaked Noah's information." "Possibly." "Dante." She turned to face him fully, her back to Noah, voice low. "What is it that someone inside your organization thinks I need to know about you? What is the thing?" He looked at her, and the quality of his look, the slight stillness of it, the almost imperceptible adjustment, the same quality she had seen the night before when she'd asked him about things he'd done without telling her, registered in her chest like a key turning. "What aren't you telling me?" she said. And he opened his mouth to answer, and his phone rang, and he looked at the screen and something moved through his face. Not fear. Dante Vescari did not do fear in the conventional sense, but something adjacent to it, something that had the shape of dread. And he answered it, and he listened for 12 seconds, and then he said very quietly, "Where?" and listened again and hung up. He looked at her, and the look was different from every other look he had given her across the whole long night. "Noah's school," he said. "Someone tripped the alarm on the access gate 40 minutes ago. My people were watching it as a precaution." He paused, and she watched him decide to say the next part and then say it. "A man matching the description of the photographer from last night was seen at the south entrance. He had a vehicle. He was watching the gate at 7:47 in the morning, 43 minutes before the school day started, 43 minutes before 180 children, including one boy in dinosaur pajamas who didn't know his heart was broken and didn't know his father was standing in his kitchen and didn't know that anything in the world was wrong, would file through that gate for what was supposed to be an ordinary Wednesday." Emery looked at Dante, and the cold clarity was back, sharper than it had been before, so sharp it almost didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like information. "They weren't going to wait," she said. "No," he said. "They weren't." She turned to the table. Noah had finished his cereal and was watching them both with the careful attention of a child who had learned early to read the adult atmosphere of a room and knew right now that the atmosphere was something he hadn't encountered before. "Mom," he said. "What's wrong?" She crossed to the table and crouched down to his level, and she looked at her son's face, at his eyes that were Dante's eyes, and she put her hand on the side of his face, and she said, as evenly as she could manage, "We're going to do something a little different today, okay? We're going to stay home this morning." "But the field trip, I know, Bug. I'm going to make it up to you, I promise." He searched her face. He was 7, and he was perceptive, and he was looking at her the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. "Is it about that man?" he said. "The big man?" She kept her hand on his face. She kept her breathing even. "His name is Dante," she said. And then, because she had spent 7 years making one choice and had perhaps 30 seconds to decide whether to make a different one, she said, "He's someone who knew me a long time ago, before you were born. Someone important." Noah looked past her at Dante, who was standing very still in the kitchen doorway. Noah looked at him for a long, serious moment. "He has the same eyes as me," Noah said. The sentence dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it spread out, and there was no collecting them back. Emery's hand was still on her son's face. She could feel his pulse at his temple, that particular rhythm, the one with the slight catch in it that she had memorized across 7 years of sleepless listening. "Yeah," she said very quietly. "He does." And in the kitchen doorway, Dante Vescari made a sound that was not quite a breath and not quite anything else. And Emery understood with sudden and absolute certainty that whatever the unknown caller wanted to tell her, whatever it was that Dante hadn't said yet, whatever the Serrano network was planning at a school gate 43 minutes from now, none of it was going to be survived by staying in this. She stood up. She crossed to Dante in 3 steps and she said, low enough that Noah couldn't hear from the table, "Tell me what you weren't telling me, right now, before we move, before anything else. What does the person in your organization want me to know?" His eyes held hers. The dread she had seen in them before the phone call was still there, underneath the operational layer, and she watched him make the decision to say it. "When I was building the network," he said, very quiet, "in the first years after I got out, I made agreements with people to survive. Some of those agreements involved information exchanges, intelligence about rival families, about law enforcement movements, about..." He stopped. "About protected witnesses, people who had testified and been relocated." She waited. 3 years ago," he said, "the Serrano network approached me. They wanted access to those channels. I refused. They responded by finding leverage." He held her gaze and didn't look away from it. "The leverage they found was you. Your location. Noah's existence. They had been watching me look for you, and they had found you first, and they held that information as a guarantee of my cooperation." He breathed once. "I never gave them what they wanted, but I also never..." "You knew where we were," she said. "For 8 months before I came to the restaurant," he said. "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Behind her, Noah was pushing his cereal around, the dinosaur pajamas, the slight uneven sound of his breathing across the room. 8 months, she said. "I was trying to neutralize the threat before I made contact. I didn't want to come to you while they still held..." 8 months, she said again. And this time it wasn't a repetition, it was a verdict, and he heard it that way, and he didn't try to answer it. She turned back to her son. "Noah, get dressed, okay? We're going on a trip." He looked at her, then at Dante, then back at her with the eyes that were both of theirs. "What kind of trip?" "The kind where you pack your overnight bag and bring the book you're reading and don't ask too many questions yet." He slid off his chair. He had learned, across 7 years of a life that had required it of him, to read his mother's voice for the register that meant now. And he heard it now. And he went. Dante's phone was already at his ear before Noah's door closed. He was moving, his voice low and rapid, and she watched him coordinate the kind of operation that required a level of infrastructure she was only beginning to understand the scope of. And she thought about 8 months, and she thought about the restaurant, and she thought about whether he had sat across that dining room table from her at any point during those 8 months, and what those nights had looked like for a man who knew where his son was and chose to stay away. And she felt something that was too complicated to name and too immediate to spend time on. She packed a bag for Noah. She packed one for herself. She did it in 7 minutes because she was a woman who had learned to pack fast years ago, who kept the essential documents in a fireproof box she could grab in under 30 seconds, who knew exactly which of Noah's stuffed animals he needed and which ones he could leave. They left the apartment at 8:04. The convoy was 3 vehicles this time, moving fast through morning traffic with a coordination that parted the city around them. Noah sat between Emery and the window in the back seat of the middle SUV, his overnight bag on his lap, looking out at the streets moving past with the focused attention he gave to things he was still deciding how to feel about. He had not asked again about Dante. He was processing. She knew his processing face. Dante was in the front seat. He turned once to look back at them, at Noah specifically, and then turned forward again. They were 40 blocks north and moving toward a highway exchange when Dante's lead man, the wide-shouldered one whose name she had learned was Reyes, received a call on his earpiece, and the specific way his body changed when he heard what he heard made the back of Emery's neck go cold before he said a word. "Boss," Reyes said, flat, careful. Dante looked at him. "The school," Reyes said. "The Serrano people. They didn't pull back. They moved." He paused. "They have a kid, one of Noah's classmates. They're calling it a mistake, saying they grabbed the wrong—" Dante said one word that Noah definitely heard, and that Emery couldn't bring herself to address because she was already doing the math, and the math was the thing the text message had been about, the leverage, the thing that was worse than a photograph. "They grabbed a child to use as a demonstration," Dante said, "to show me what they're willing to do." "Marcus Chen," Reyes said. 8 years old, Noah's friend. Noah went absolutely still beside her. She felt him go still. She felt the quality of it change, from the passive stillness of a child watching the city to something with a held breath in it, and she put her hand on his arm and he said very quietly, "Marcus is my best friend." "I know, Bug." "They have Marcus." She didn't answer that. She couldn't give him a useful answer to that without lying, and she had decided before he could talk that she would not lie to him about the things that mattered. About smaller things, yes. About his father, briefly, out of necessity. But not about this. "We're going to help," she said. "Emery." Dante's voice from the front seat. Warning register. "Don't," she said. He turned. She looked at him directly, her hand still on Noah's arm. "Don't tell me to stay out of it. A child I know is in this because of us. Because of this situation. That is not something I stay out of." "You're not trained for—" "I have been managing impossible situations with zero resources for 7 years," she said. "Do not talk to me about what I'm not." The SUV was quiet for a moment. Then Dante turned back to the front and said to Reyes, "Location." It took 40 minutes and 3 phone calls and one of Dante's people who apparently did nothing but track electronic signals to establish that Marcus Chen was being held in a warehouse complex in a port district on the south side of the city. The complex was decommissioned, partially demolished, 3 buildings still standing around a central yard that fronted a private waterway. They pulled off the highway and into an industrial area that smelled of salt water and rust, and Dante's people assembled in a parking structure with the quiet efficiency of people who had done variations of this before. Emery watched them check weapons and distribute earpieces and communicate in the abbreviated language of people who had worked together under pressure long enough that half their communication was gestural. She turned to Noah. This was the part she had been preparing for in the back of her mind for the last 40 minutes, the part with no good version. "You're going to stay here," she said, "in this vehicle. Reyes is going to stay with you." Reyes looked at Dante. Dante looked at Reyes. Something passed between them. "He's staying with Noah," Dante confirmed. Noah looked at Reyes, then at Emery. "You're going in." "Yes. Both of you." She kept her eyes on his. "Yes." He looked at the overnight bag on his lap. He looked at it for a moment with the specific expression she recognized as the one he wore when he was deciding whether to argue about something he already knew he couldn't change. Then he looked up. "Bring Marcus back," he said. She put her hand on his face the way she had in the kitchen. The same gesture. His pulse at his temple, the same rhythm. "Yeah, Bug," she said. "That's the plan." She got out of the SUV before the pressure behind her sternum could migrate somewhere more visible. Dante was beside her in the cold morning air. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about Noah, about what he'd just said and how he'd said it, about the specific economy of a 7-year-old who had spent his whole life watching his mother go toward hard things and had learned to send her off cleanly. "You stay close to me," Dante said. "I'm not a liability." "I know you're not. I said stay close to me. That's not the same thing." She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. The approach to the warehouse complex took 11 minutes on foot, through access roads that smelled of brine and old diesel. Dante's team moved with a practiced silence that she matched by focusing on her breathing, on the ground under her feet, on the cold air against her face. She had changed out of her restaurant clothes in the apartment. She was wearing her work jeans and flat shoes that were not ideal for this, but were better than the non-slip restaurant flats. And she moved through the industrial dark, thinking about how strange the body was, how it committed to the present moment, even when the present moment was this. The warehouse complex resolved out of the gray morning, 3 large structures around a central yard, chain-link fencing, a rusted crane arm extended over the waterway. 2 of Dante's men who had been deployed ahead were already at the perimeter fence, crouched at a gap where the chain link had been pulled back at the base. One of them held up 2 fingers, and then 4 fingers, and then pointed at the far building, the rightmost structure, where a light was visible through a high window. 2 guards outside, 4 inside. Marcus in the far building. Dante absorbed this, looked at the layout, made a decision in about 8 seconds that involved distributing his people into a pattern she could see the logic of even without military training. The angle of approach, the need to control the outer guards before the inner ones could be alerted, the specific timing that would need to hold across multiple simultaneous actions. He looked at her. The far building has a side access door. It'll be the one they're not watching because they think it's sealed. He paused. It's not sealed. My man checked it from the satellite view. Padlock on a hasp that's pulled out of the rotted frame. He met her eyes. I need someone to go through that door from the south while we take the main approach from the north. Someone small enough to move fast in the interior without being heard before we breach the front. She understood what he was asking. What's inside? Storage, empty racking, concrete floor. He paused. Marcus will be in the northeast corner, away from the doors. That's standard. How do you know it's standard? Because I've done this, he said, and the flatness in those 3 words was the weight of a life she didn't know yet, and might never fully know, and this was not the moment to examine that. If I get to him before your breach, she said, keep him down and keep him quiet and wait for the gunfire to stop. Very reassuring. Do you want reassuring or do you want accurate? Accurate, she said, always accurate. He reached into his jacket and produced a compact flashlight and a zip tie cutter and a folding knife that he placed in her hand with a matter-of-fact precision, and she took them with the same and put them in her jacket pocket. Don't engage anyone, he said. You get to the boy. You get him down. You wait. Got it. Emery. He said her name and waited until she looked at him fully. Be careful. It wasn't the operational tone. It was something else. Something that had the weight of 8 years in it, and the weight of this morning in the kitchen, and the weight of a boy in dinosaur pajamas saying he has the same eyes as me, and she felt all of that in the 2 words, and she held it for exactly 1 second. You too, she said. She moved south. The south wall of the far building was in deep shadow, the morning light blocked by the crane structure overhead. She moved along the fence line, low, fast, the way she moved between rooms in the hotel when she was behind on her quota, the same quality of purposeful invisibility. The hasp was exactly where Dante said it would be, a padlock through a steel loop that had been screwed into wood frame that had gone soft with moisture and age, the whole assembly pulling free from the wall with a damp tearing sound when she applied pressure at the right angle. She stopped, listened. Nothing changed in the building. She pushed the door open 6 inches and slipped through. Inside was dark and cold and smelled of mildew and old concrete and the thin metallic smell of rust coming off the empty racking units that stretched back into the shadows. The light she had seen from outside was coming from the far end, the northeast corner, a work lamp on a portable stand casting a hard yellow circle on the concrete floor. She could see the boy. Marcus Chen was seated on the floor with his back against a support column, his hands zip-tied in front of him, his face wet from what had been recent crying, though he wasn't crying now. He was 8 years old and he was wearing his school backpack, which meant they had grabbed him at the gate before he'd had a chance to put it down. And something about the backpack, the complete ordinary wrongness of it in this context, hit her somewhere visceral. 2 men were visible in the lit area, one sitting on a folding chair, one standing looking at his phone. She was in the shadow of the racking unit 60 feet from Marcus, and Marcus was looking at the floor and hadn't seen her. She moved. Slow. Heel to toe on the concrete, testing each step before transferring weight, the way she moved through hotel rooms at night when guests were asleep and she was retrieving a cart. The racking units provided cover every 10 feet. She made 30 feet without a sound. Then Marcus looked up. She saw the exact moment he registered her, the small convulsion of surprise in his body, the intake of breath. And she had her finger at her lips in the same instant, and the child, who was 8 years old and terrified and in a warehouse with his school backpack on, looked at her with enormous eyes and pressed his lips together and did not make a sound. Good kid, she thought. Noah had good taste in friends. She made the last 30 feet in 3 movements, racking to column to crouch beside Marcus, and she had the zip tie cutter in her hand before she was fully settled. His hands were in front of her, and she cut the tie in 2 seconds and put her hand briefly on his wrist. Warm, pulse going fast but even. And then she was pulling him toward her, getting him oriented, turning them both so the column was between them and the 2 men. "Can you run?" she whispered, her mouth close to his ear. He nodded. "On my signal, straight back, through the south door. Don't stop." He nodded again. She could feel him shaking. She kept her hand on his arm and she let him shake because there was nothing wrong with shaking when this was the situation, and stopping the shaking was not the point. The gunfire started at the north end of the building, 1 shot. Then immediately several more, then shouting, then the specific massive sound of a steel door being hit with something heavy and giving way. And both of Serrano's men in the lit area were moving toward the sound, with weapons out before the echo had finished. And Emery said, "Now!" And Marcus ran. She ran behind him. The south door was still open, the hasp hanging, and Marcus hit it at full speed, and she was 3 steps behind him when she heard the shout from inside the building. Someone had turned and seen them. And she was through the door and pulling it back behind her when something hit the interior side of it, and she held it closed with her full body weight, both hands on the frame, feet braced against the wet concrete outside, and she thought quite clearly, "This door is rotted and is not going to hold." It held for 6 seconds. On the 7th, it tore open, and the man on the other side came through it fast and low, and she was already moving left and not fast enough. His shoulder caught her, and she hit the ground hard, side of the hip and then elbow. The flashlight gone from her pocket somewhere. The cold concrete wet against her cheek, and she was already rolling because staying flat was the one thing you could not do, and she got upright in time to put distance between herself and him, and she had the folding knife in her hand without having made a conscious decision to put it there. The man was big. Bigger than her by a significant margin, and he had a gun that he was bringing up, and she was not going to close the distance before he had it level, and she knew this with the clean precision of someone with very little time to process options. Marcus screamed from somewhere to her right. The man's attention fractured, 1 fraction of a second. His eyes moved and Emery moved, and the knife was not for fighting with. Dante had given her a tool, not a weapon, but the heel of her palm connected with the side of his gun hand. At the same moment, she drove her elbow into his throat, and his shot went wide and hit the chain link somewhere to the left, and the gun dropped. And she was already back, putting space between them, watching him stagger against the wall with his hand at his throat. Then Dante was there. He came around the corner of the building at a speed that did not look like a man who had just cleared a warehouse, and the efficiency with which he handled the next 4 seconds was something she watched with the distant clarity of someone in shock adjacent. Not quite shock, but close enough to feel the edges of it. The man who had put his hands on her was no longer a functional problem. That was the most accurate way she could categorize it. Dante turned. He looked at her. He did a fast inventory the way he'd done in the restaurant, eyes moving, reading for damage. "I'm fine," she said. "Your elbow." "I said I'm fine." She looked past him. "Marcus. My people have him." He paused. "He's okay." She let out a breath. It came out longer than she intended, a full structural release, and she stood there in the cold morning air next to a rusted warehouse, and she felt the adrenaline begin its long, slow withdrawal from her system and the things it left behind when it went. She looked at Dante. His lip was cut, and there was a darkening under his left eye that was going to be significant by tomorrow, and his jacket was torn at the shoulder seam, and he looked, for the first time since she'd seen him walk into the restaurant, like something approximating a man rather than a function. "The Serrano leader," she said. "The one running this, is he in there?" Dante's expression shifted slightly. "No." "Where?" "He wasn't on site." He runs this from a distance. He paused. He'll know this failed within the hour. When he does, he'll make a calculation. What calculation? Whether to pull back or escalate past the point of any reasonable. His phone rang. He looked at the screen and something moved through his face, and he answered it, and she watched him listen, and she watched his face go through something she didn't have a name for. Something with the quality of a man receiving information that reorganizes the structure of everything he thought he understood about a situation. He lowered the phone. "What?" she said. "The man inside my organization," he said, "who leaked Noah's information, who sent you the text." He paused. "It wasn't one of my security people. It wasn't an operational associate." His voice was level, but underneath the level there was something raw being held down by considerable effort. "It was Marco, my second in command, the man who's been with me for 6 years." He stopped. "He didn't just leak Noah's information," Dante said. "He's been working with Serrano for 2 years. Everything I've planned, every defensive move I've made in the past 48 hours, Serrano knew about it. In advance." He looked at her. "The restaurant, the convoy routes, this location." His jaw tightened until she could see the muscle working under the skin. "Marco gave them all of it." She stared at him. "He's still in the network," Dante said. "He's been managing my response to his own betrayal from inside my operation." He paused, and the pause had a specific quality, the quality of something being said that had been building behind enormous pressure for a very long time. And right now, he has access to every piece of information about what we just did here, which means Serrano knows we have Marcus, which means Serrano knows where we are, which means his phone rang again. Different tone. Emergency. He answered. He listened for 3 seconds. "Noah," Emery said. She was already moving. Dante's voice behind her, running into the phone. "How many, which direction, Reyes, tell me Reyes." But Reyes wasn't answering, and the parking structure was 600 meters north, and Emery was running through the port district in the gray morning with the taste of adrenaline back in her throat and her elbow screaming where she'd hit the concrete. And somewhere ahead of her was a parking structure, and inside it was an SUV, and inside the SUV was a 7-year-old boy with a broken heart and his father's eyes. And the only thing that she ran the 600 meters in the kind of time that didn't feel like running, felt like falling forward and catching herself and falling again. The port district concrete uneven under her feet, the cold morning air turning her exhales to vapor, her elbow a steady hard signal of pain that she filed and ignored. Dante was beside her. He ran differently than she did. Longer stride, less wasted motion, the mechanical efficiency of someone who had needed to run toward things for years. But he stayed beside her, and she understood that as a choice he was making, and she didn't have time to feel anything about it. The parking structure came into view. Concrete, 3 levels, the entrance ramp facing them. One of Dante's SUVs was still visible on the ground level, pulled in facing out the way his drivers always positioned them. The second SUV was gone. The third was at an angle it hadn't been in when they left. Driver's door open, no one inside. Emery hit the entrance ramp without slowing. Dante's hand caught her arm. "Don't run in blind," he said, breathing hard. Not as hard as her. "Noah is... I know. Give me 3 seconds." He was already on his radio, 1 word, 2 words, listening. He listened for 4 seconds that had the weight of considerably longer. Then, "Reyes is down, non-fatal, south corner." "And Noah?" He looked at her. The cut on his lip had been bleeding and the blood had dried in the cold, and he looked like a man who had come a long way and wasn't done yet. And he said, "They have him. They moved north. There's a waterfront facility. My people tracked the vehicle." He paused. "Marco is there. Serrano's lead operator is there." Another pause. "Noah is there." She looked at him for exactly 1 second. "Then that's where we go." Reyes was in the south corner of the ground level, sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to his side and his face the color of old concrete, which she was beginning to recognize as the standard color of Dante's people when they had been recently shot. He was conscious and he was angry, which she had come to understand as a positive indicator among men in this profession. "Kid fought," Reyes said, looking at Dante. The statement had something in it that was not quite admiration, but adjacent to it. They had to use something to put him under. He's not... They wanted him moving, not injured. They need him to walk in. Walk in where? Emery said. Reyes looked at Dante. Walk in where? She said again. It's a negotiation move, Dante said. Serrano wants a sit-down. He's using Noah as the guarantee I show up without a full security detail. He held her eyes, and she could see him making the decision to give her all of it rather than any version of it. Marco told him everything about my operation, which means Serrano knows that the one thing I won't calculate around is Noah. He paused. He's right. So Serrano sets the terms, she said. He thinks he does. She looked at him. What do you know that he doesn't? And she watched something happen in his face, not quite a smile, nothing so simple as that, but a particular quality of focus sharpening into something that had the shape of a plan. Marco has been inside my operation for 2 years. He has everything. He paused. Except for one thing I moved 6 months ago, when I first started to suspect I had a problem I couldn't identify yet. I moved it and told no one, not even Marco. What did you move? Documentation, he said. 3 years of it. Every agreement I ever made with the Serrano network under duress. Every communication, every record of what they coerced and what I gave and what I refused. Everything that demonstrates the nature of the relationship between Serrano's people and mine, that it was coercive, not cooperative. He let that land. It's enough to dismantle every remaining syndicate associated with Serrano if it reaches the right people. Enough to end this entire network permanently. And it's in a location only I know. She understood. You were going to use it eventually. I was waiting for the right moment. This is the right moment, she said. This is the moment he gives me no choice but to make it the right moment, Dante said. Yes. She looked at him, and she thought about 8 years, and she thought about 8 months, and she thought about the things a person became under the kind of pressure that had been applied to both of them, separately, across the same years. And she thought that whatever he had become was not simple and was not clean and was not something she was going to resolve her feelings about today or possibly ever, but that it was also not what his father had been, and that distinction mattered even if she hadn't decided yet exactly how much. Take me with you, she said. Emery, he's my son. I will not sit in a parking structure while you walk into a room where my son is. She held his gaze and she held it steady, and she said, I was useful tonight. You know I was. I am not a variable you can optimize around. I am his mother. Take me. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Reyes, who was being helped up by one of the other men who had appeared from somewhere in the structure. Then he looked back at her. You stay behind me when we enter, he said. You don't move toward Noah until I clear the room. You do exactly what I tell you to do exactly when I tell you to do it. Yes, she said, not because she was surrendering authority, because she was accepting a division of labor she understood the logic of. If it goes wrong, it's not going to go wrong, she said, because you're going to walk in there and give Serrano exactly what he wants long enough to not give it to him at all, and while you're doing that, I'm going to get to Noah. She paused. That's the plan, isn't it? He looked at her. Something moved through his face, something old and specific. The look of someone recognizing a person they had lost and finding them still present, still fundamentally themselves despite everything. That's the plan, he said. The waterfront facility was 20 minutes north, a private pier complex that had been used for legitimate freight operations until 3 years ago and had been in a state of managed disuse since. The kind of property that appeared on records as under remediation and appeared in reality as available. They approached it from the waterside, Dante and 3 of his remaining people in Emery, in a rigid hull inflatable that came out of nowhere and that she had stopped asking questions about because the operational infrastructure of Dante's life was apparently as deep as it was various. The facility had 3 structures on the pier. The central one was lit. They could see it from the water, a warm yellow glow through industrial windows. And she fixed her eyes on it, and she felt the cold air off the water, and she felt the boat moving under her, and she thought about Noah putting his lips together in the warehouse and not making a sound, and she felt the fear move through her like a current, and then she felt it settle into something functional. Because this was what you did. This was what she had always done. You took the fear and you didn't pretend it wasn't there, and you made it work for you. They came in at the south end of the pier, away from the lit building. No one challenged them. Dante had said there would be no exterior guards at this approach, and there weren't, and she had stopped asking how he knew things like this too. They moved along the pier in single file, low, fast, and she moved between Dante and the man behind her, and she focused on the sound of her own feet and the sound of the water below the pier boards and the specific quality of the night around them, and she thought, this is what it is. Not the life she planned, not the life she had 9 years ago in any version imagined for herself, but this, right here, moving toward her son on a pier in the dark, beside a man she was nowhere near done being angry at and nowhere near done knowing. This was what she had, and she was going to walk into it with everything she had. Dante stopped them at the corner of the central building. He looked at her. One look, direct, brief. She nodded. He went in through the main door first. She heard him say, "Serrano," and then she counted to 4 and went in through the side door that his man had already opened, and the room was large and industrial, cold and high-ceilinged, lit by work lamps that cast the same hard yellow light as the warehouse earlier, and she had the geography of it in under 2 seconds. Dante and Serrano's lead operator facing each other across 15 feet of empty space, 4 of Serrano's men positioned around the room, and in the northeast corner, on the floor against a column, a small shape in a school backpack. Not Noah's backpack, Noah's jacket, the blue one from the photograph. Noah was awake. Whatever they had used on him had worn off or was wearing off, and he was sitting up against the column with his eyes open and his face very still. And when she came through the side door, he found her immediately, the way children found their mothers across large and noisy spaces, some frequency between them that cut through everything else. She shook her head, one small motion. Not yet. He understood. He sat still. Serrano's lead operator was a man named Vega, who she knew now from what Dante had told her on the boat. Medium height, economical in how he held himself, the kind of dangerous that didn't advertise. He was looking at Dante with the particular expression of a man who believed he held every card in a hand he'd been building for 2 years. "Vescari," Vega said, "you came with fewer people than I expected." "I came to talk," Dante said. "You wanted a conversation. Here I am." "Where's the documentation?" "Safe." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now," Dante said. "What happens in this conversation determines what happens to the documentation." He looked around the room, unhurried, the way he had looked around the restaurant when he walked in, that sweeping professional read. "You've been building toward this for 2 years. 2 years of Marco feeding you information, letting you think you had me positioned. So let's talk about what you actually have." Vega watched him. "You have an 8-year-old child who has nothing to do with this," Dante said. "You have a man who's been working against me from inside my operation, which tells me you were never confident you could take me directly, which means you're weaker than the position you're trying to hold. And you have a room full of people in a location the documentation names specifically as a Serrano operational site, which means if that documentation surfaces in the next hour, everyone in this room except me and the child and that woman in the corner goes away for a very long time." Vega's eyes moved to Emery for the first time. She held still. "That's a threat," Vega said. "It's a fact," Dante said. "The threat would be me telling you that I already sent the location of the documentation to a federal contact 40 minutes ago, and that the only thing preventing that contact from acting on it is a check-in call I need to make within the next 45 minutes. He paused. "Which I can't make from this building if I'm dead, and which I won't make if Noah Holloway is not released right now and walking out that door." The room held its breath. Vega looked at Dante. He looked at the room, his own people, their positions, the geometry of a situation he had spent 2 years engineering that was now presenting itself in a shape he hadn't accounted for. She watched him do the math. She watched the math not come out the way he'd planned. "The documentation burns your network too," Vega said. "Everything in it implicates you." "Yes," Dante said simply. "You'd destroy yourself." "I'd end this," Dante said. "There's a difference." He let that sit for a moment. "Your network or my freedom?" That's the exchange you're looking at, and the child walks out first, or the exchange doesn't happen. Vega looked at Noah. Noah was watching Dante with an expression Emery couldn't fully see from her angle, but she could see enough. The absolute focused attention of a child who was listening to something he didn't have all the context for and was nevertheless understanding in some essential way. Vega looked at one of his men and made a small motion. The man crossed to Noah. Noah stood up on his own before the man reached him, which he noted and felt something fierce and aching about simultaneously. He walked across the room toward the door on his own feet, and Emery moved when he moved, and she was at the door when he reached it, and her hands were on him. Both hands, shoulder and face, the same instinctive inventory she did every time he came home from anywhere, and she felt him solid and present and unhurt under her hands, and she breathed once, fully, for the first time in what felt like hours. "Mom," he said, very quiet. "Yeah," she said, "I've got you." She kept one hand on his shoulder and she turned back to the room. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. She had understood going in that it would not be clean, that there was no version of this that was clean, and she watched it with her hand on her son's shoulder, and she did not look away from any of it because looking away felt like a form of dishonesty she couldn't afford. Two of Serrano's men made decisions that Dante's people responded to with the speed and finality that ended those decisions permanently. Vega himself made a calculation that involved reaching for something he shouldn't have reached for at the moment he reached for it, which put him on the floor with Dante's knee in his back and his hands behind him, and the cold professional voice in his ear explaining exactly what was going to happen next. Marco was not in the room. Marco had not been in the room. Dante looked up from Vega and looked at her, and she shook her head. "He's not here." His jaw tightened. He stood. He said something to his remaining man and handed Vega off and crossed the room to her, and he stood in front of her and Noah, and he looked at his son with that expression she had seen twice now, the unguarded one, the one that dismantled the controlled surface. And Noah looked back at him. "You told him," Noah said to Emery, not accusing, stating. "Not everything yet," she said, "but he's—" Noah looked at Dante. "You're not dead." "No," Dante said. His voice came out rough again. Noah looked at him for a long moment with the evaluating seriousness she knew well. "Mom told me you died because she didn't know you were alive," he said. "That's different from lying." Dante looked at Emery. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything. "I know things aren't simple," Noah said, with the gravity of someone who had been paying attention to the world for 7 years and had arrived at a real conclusion about it. "Mom says that. Things aren't simple and you deal with them anyway." Outside, police sirens had begun, still distant but closing. Dante had made the call. He had done what he said he was going to do. Sent the location, released the documentation, made the exchange that would end this and cost him what it cost him, and the sirens were the sound of that cost arriving in real time. He looked at Emery. "I need to stay," he said. "I know. This is going to be complicated. The federal arrangement—" He stopped. "It's going to take time. There are things I have to answer for, not just Serrano. My own—" He stopped again. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to—" "I know what you're not asking." She held his gaze. "We'll talk. After. About what any of this looks like." She paused. "Right now I need to take him home." Dante looked at Noah one more time. Noah was looking at him with those eyes. His eyes. She had never been able to look at them without knowing, even in the years when she'd tried not to know. And Dante did something she hadn't seen him do across the entire length of this night that had rearranged her life. He crouched down. He put himself at eye level with Noah, which made him suddenly less like a man who ran a criminal empire and more like a person who was simply trying to be present in a moment he hadn't earned yet. "I have a lot to explain to you," Dante said to Noah. "I know that. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Noah looked at him. "Are you going to be around to explain it?" Dante's throat moved. "Yes," he said. "If that's— yes." Noah considered this. "Okay," he said, with the same pragmatic weight he'd used that morning about the man on the couch. Then he looked at his mother. "Can we go home? I'm really tired." She put her hand in his hair, and she looked over his head at Dante still crouched on the floor of the warehouse, and she said, "Yeah, Bug, we're going home." She found out later that Marco had been at the facility earlier in the evening and had left before they arrived, which meant he had known the exchange was coming and had made his own calculation about what side of it he wanted to be on when it resolved. The federal contact Dante had built over 3 quiet years found Marco at an airport outside the city at 11:40 that night, with a bag that contained enough documentation of his own cooperation with Serrano to constitute a full and generous confession. He did not appear to have needed much encouragement to provide the rest. The Serrano network came apart over the following weeks in the way that structures came apart when the documentation of their internal mechanics became public. Fast, and then faster, and then all at once. The acceleration of collapse once the keystone was removed. There were arrests in 4 cities. There were people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment, to step away from things they had been unable to step away from before, and those people moved quickly. Dante spent 6 weeks in federal custody and came out under an arrangement that his lawyers had been quietly building the framework for during the same period he had been looking for Emery, which she found out about approximately 8 weeks after the warehouse, and which produced a conversation between them that lasted 4 hours and covered things she had been waiting years to say, and things he had apparently been waiting years to hear, and things neither of them had known they needed to say until they were saying them. The conversation did not resolve everything. She had not expected it to resolve everything. What it resolved was enough to constitute a beginning. Noah's surgery happened in the spring. Doctor. Anand had a colleague, a pediatric cardiothoracic specialist, who had done this particular procedure more than most, and Emery sat in a waiting room for 4 hours and 20 minutes with Greta on one side of her and Dante on the other, and she did not make conversation because she was not capable of it, and neither Greta nor Dante tried to make her, which she would be grateful for across a long time. Noah came out of the surgery the way Noah came out of most things. Slowly, then all at once, with a stubbornness that Dr. Anand found personally affront and professionally satisfying. He was in the hospital for 5 days. He complained about the food with a specificity and consistency that the nursing staff found charming, and that Emery found the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. On the 3rd day, Dante brought him a book about deep-sea creatures that was significantly too advanced for a 2nd grader and read it to him anyway, and she sat in the chair by the window and watched them and felt something so complex she had no available word for it, something that had grief and relief and anger and hope all running through it simultaneously like colors that hadn't been mixed yet. The cafe was still hers in the mornings. She had reduced the hotel shifts to 2 days a week, not because she couldn't manage them, but because she had done the math again, and the math, for the first time in a very long time, had given her a different answer. She had kept the restaurant Fridays because she liked Felix's grudging acknowledgement of her competence, and she liked the specific community of people who worked that shift, and she had come to understand that she was allowed to keep things she liked, that keeping things for reasons of liking them was a valid form of resource management. She still walked fast. She didn't think that would change. Marcus Chen came back to school 2 weeks after the warehouse, with the particular resilience of an 8-year-old who had processed a significant experience and emerged from it with what appeared to be primarily a very good story. Noah had called him every day during his own recovery. Their friendship had the specific, deepened quality of 2 children who had been through something together that most people their age hadn't, and Emery observed it from a respectful distance and felt uncomplicated gratitude for it, which she noted as a new experience, being able to feel something uncomplicated. 4 months after the warehouse, on a Tuesday morning when the cafe was quiet in the mid-morning lull and she was restocking the pastry case and thinking about nothing in particular, which was itself a new experience, the door opened and the bell above it rang its small aluminum ring. She looked up. Dante was standing in the doorway. He was wearing a jacket she hadn't seen before, and his hair needed cutting, and the scar through his eyebrow that she still didn't know the full story of caught the morning light. And he was not accompanied by anyone, which she noticed because she was still in the habit of noticing, and he was holding 2 hot chocolates from the place 3 doors down that Noah had declared the best in the city. A declaration he had made with the complete authority of a child who has found something he likes and sees no reason to moderate his enthusiasm about it. He held one of them up. A question. She looked at him across the counter of the cafe. She thought about the 4-hour conversation. She thought about the waiting room and the 5 days and the book about deep-sea creatures. She thought about what Greta had said to her one evening on the building steps, with the directness that Emery had always valued in her, that damaged people were not automatically incapable of being what someone needed, that the damage and the capacity existed in the same person at the same time, and the question was always what you decided to do about both. She thought about Noah coming home from school last week and telling her, with the studied casualness of a child who had thought carefully about how to introduce a subject, that Dante had said they could maybe go see something at the Natural History Museum on Saturday if that was okay, and that he, Noah, thought it sounded pretty good if she thought it sounded pretty good. She had thought it sounded pretty good. She came around the counter. She took the hot chocolate from his hand. It was warm through the paper cup, and the morning outside the cafe windows was the particular light of late autumn in the city, that low gold that didn't last, and the street was doing what streets did, full of people moving through their lives with no awareness that the woman standing inside this window had spent the last several months rebuilding the architecture of hers from a foundation that had turned out to be more solid than she'd understood. She sat down at the nearest table. She looked at him, and she tilted her head at the chair across from her. He sat down. He put his own cup on the table. He didn't say anything, which was something she had come to recognize as one of the things she had never given him enough credit for. Knowing when silence was the right instrument. Outside, a kid on a bike cut between 2 parked cars, and a man walking a dog stopped to let a woman pass, and the traffic light changed, and the city continued its absolute indifference to the specific coordinates of any individual life, which she had always found oddly comforting, the way the world scale put things in proportion. She drank her hot chocolate. He drank his. Noah wants to know, she said eventually, if you know anything about deep-sea creatures beyond what was in that book. Dante looked at her. Something shifted in his face, that specific movement she was learning to read, the one that meant the containment had loosened on something real. I know a moderate amount, he said. He's going to test you. I know. He's going to ask very specific questions, and he's going to know if you're making things up. I've been doing some reading, Dante said. She looked at him. She felt something move through her that was not simple and was not complete and was not going to be either of those things for a long time, if ever, because nothing about this was simple and complete was a condition she had stopped expecting of real things. But it was present. It was specific. It had her name on it, and his and Noah's, and it had the quality of something that had survived a great deal of pressure and come out on the other side changed, but intact. Not perfect. Intact. She put her cup down. She looked at the table, at the scarred wood of it, old cafe table with rings from 1,000 cups, and the particular worn quality of something that had been used heavily and continued to exist. Saturday, she said. Museum, 11 o'clock. She looked up at him. And you're buying lunch. Dante looked at her across the table in the quiet of the cafe on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, with the light coming through the windows at that low gold angle, and the expression on his face was the one she had seen twice in the warehouse, and once in the hospital, and once on the building steps at dusk. The unguarded one, the one without the controlled surface, the one that looked like the man he might have always been underneath everything that had been required of him. Yes, he said. That was all. Just yes. Outside, the light held. It wouldn't last. That was the nature of autumn light. Its value was its brevity. But right now it was there, gold and level, filling the street where for a long time there had been mostly dark. She picked up her cup. She looked at the window. She let the light be there while it was there. That was enough. For today, that was exactly enough.